Well, hello everybody, this is Murray back with you in this 35th edition of my podcast, Lone Star Diary. I'm happy to have you with us, and we're going to start the podcast in just a moment. Well, folks, this podcast is going to be about actually a section and a part of the area in which I reside. Yes, this is in the area around Lavaca County, Texas. And this story is about the bad boys of Summer's Thicket. The bad boys of Summer's Thicket. Summer's Thicket was a hideout back in the day, back in 1864. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that hideout and the men that were in it in just a moment. You know, folks, towards the end of the Civil War, there were some men in Texas and throughout the South who had given up on the Confederate cause. It was late in the war and they were homesick and tired of fighting. Some who had been on furlough simply refused to return to their units. As far as they were concerned, it was all over. However, the authorities didn't see it that way. The men were considered traitors and deserters, and as a result, they were forced to stay on the run. According to the book A History of Lavaca County by Paul C. Badel, men avoiding the law were looking for places that contained many trees and underbrush where they could hide out. One such place in Lavaca County was known as Summer's Thicket. The thicket was located on the Lavaca River in the southern part of the county and was home to some 30 men hiding out in there in 1864. They were said to have been deserters, draft dodgers, and just plain troublemakers from surrounding counties. Evidently, there were some men in the thicket who were bandits and preyed upon the local folks. They had been driven into Summer's Thicket by the local home guards, but the men living in the underbrush were not easy to take. You see, they were military trained, well armed and mounted, and they also had friends in the area who would warn them when elements of the Confederate Army or members of the home guard were around. And because there were a lot of cattle in the area, the desperados had plenty to eat and couldn't be starved out. In his book, Badel noted cornbread and salt were supplied by friends and relatives. Beef and barbecue constituted their main food. One fella, named John Hunter, wound up in Summer's Thicket after he was caught trying to procure some mules in Columbus that happened to belong to a Union sympathizer. But you see, he had met that Union sympathizer in Matamoros, Mexico, where they were both in hiding. The Union man was afraid to venture back into Confederate territory to get his mules, and had offered Hunter $200 to bring them back. As it turned out, the Columbus home guards captured Hunter and put him in jail. But he broke out of jail and fled on horseback to the Lavaca River bottoms. Somewhere along the way, he found shelter in the home of a woman identified simply as a Mrs. Davis. She told Hunter that her husband was also a refugee in Mexico, and she directed him to a man who eventually led him to Summer's Thicket. In his book, Badel wrote, "In the thicket, Hunter met the hardest-looking set of men he ever beheld. In the camp, he found Charlie and Grit Gallagher, Henry Dunn, Joe and Bob Tate, Wiley Clampett, Jake Hammersley, and others. But of all the men hiding in the thicket, Joe Tate was probably one of the worst. He had served in the army but wound up being court-martialed and sentenced to be shot. But as he had done many times before, once again, Tate escaped. And the army sent troops to his home to wait for him to return. But somebody tipped him off and he headed back to the brush. Tate was heavily armed and vowed never to be taken alive. So the obvious question might be, what finally happened to the men in the thicket? Well, it seems that the task of capturing all these armed men was just too great for the Lavaca guards, so the guards from Victoria, Concrete, Columbus, and Clinton were brought in to help raid the thicket. And on their way to Hallettsville, the men from Columbus arrested fugitives in the Navidad country in the Crooked Creek section. However, the men in Summers Thicket had no desire to fight the guards. No doubt they knew some of them, and Badel wrote that a few of the men decided to follow old Hunter back to Matamoros, and indeed 20 of them did. But the aforementioned Joe Tate and his brother Bob decided to stay and fight. Badel's book didn't happen to reveal their fate. Of the men who went to Mexico, some of them found work while others joined the Mexican army and actually helped overthrow the Maximilian Empire. The combined units of the Home Guards did eventually raid the thicket and capture a few of the men, but when they found out that most of the men had fled to Mexico, they gave up the chase and went home. Now that's a pretty well a local story around this parts of Texas, but a lot of people didn't know about it. Of course, there were family that still live on that property, and they saw the article in the paper and came forth and made some comments, and we're mighty happy that they did. We're happy that this article touched some folks that are descendants of that property around Summers Thicket. And you never can tell what happened to all those men. You know, I can understand why they would be giving up on the Confederate cause at that time, because the Union troops had matters well in hand, and it was just a matter of time before General Lee would surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. But friends, I hope you enjoyed this 35th edition of Lone Star Diary. I apologize that we hadn't had one in a while, but I've had a lot of irons in the fire, been real busy, but we won't forget, and we'll be always coming back with a new one. But thanks again for listening, and I hope you'll share this podcast with your friends and history lovers. But that's going to be all for this evening, and so I'll just say good night, and God bless Texas. Good night, everybody.